Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to Life on the Wrist. Hope you all are doing well today. There's been a shift in the watch collecting and the watch industry as a whole when it comes to the size of watches that individuals are wearing. I think it's safe to say that over the last 10 to 15 years, the watch industry in the collecting space has really been focused on steel sports watches. And what you found is collectors yearning after Audemars Piguet Royal Oaks and Patek Philippe Nautiluses and steel sports models like the Daytona and the Submariner from brands like Rolex. This sort of addiction to steel sports watches was really the craze, and what you ended up seeing is larger and larger watches being worn by collectors. This went obviously to the extremes, as it always does in these sort of cycles, where people were wearing 45 to 50 millimeter watches and kind of became the norm, let's say 15 years ago. And the smaller watch that was something like, let's just say 34 to 38 millimeters sort of fell out to fashion. But what I've sort of noticed, and I think a lot of people have noticed in the watch industry, is this sort of regression to the mean size, if you want to say it that way. How some collectors are realizing how maybe unpractical and in some cases unattractive larger watches are when they wear them on their wrists. Especially when you think about a 50 millimeter watch, it's very big. I think there's still a place for 50 millimeter watches in sort of utilitarian sense. If you're using like a Rolex Deepsea for a diving expedition you're going on and you want to wear a wristwatch instead of just using sort of the digital versions of what the watch is going to tell you, I think it makes total sense. But I think many people have seen this sort of regression to sort of smaller sizes comparatively, if you look at what people were wearing back in the day. This is obviously kind of focused pretty heavily on sort of modern watches, but I think we're sort of in that 38 to 40 millimeter sweet spot, which I think is sort of the mean size that a lot of people like to wear. But I think in terms of vintage watches, I think you're also seeing a similar trend. If someone wanted a big vintage watch, they were looking for like oversized chronographs from Universal Geneve that sort of pushed the 36, 38 millimeter case sizes. And I think that was something that people were looking for because, as you get into vintage watches, you don't want to go straight to that 30 millimeter watch that you're going to be wearing. You want something that sort of fits in with the current environment, the current collecting environment. But I think as people have sort of regressed to this 38 to 40 millimeter size, and also in modern watches, it's making vintage watches fit into this category. Vintage watches at a smaller size fit into this category a little bit more. I think a good example is like a 36 millimeter Datejust, like this watch here. Get this focus so you can at least see it. This 36 millimeter Datejust is a good example of a watch that isn't going to fit everyone's wrist, but it's 36 millimeters, it's a Datejust. People are being a little bit more open to wearing these, and that's sort of happened over the last 2 to 3 years, where they're becoming a little bit more common on people's wrists. But I think it's hard to really point to a specific catalyst that sort of has pushed collectors into being open to smaller cases. I think you could point to the vintage watch market and how there was a lot of excitement around vintage watches, let's say starting in 2016, 2017, especially stemming from Paul Newman Rolex Daytona that sold at auction. This really created a hype around older watches, and people were listening and really looking to be educated in vintage watches. And so they start exploring those, they start looking for aesthetics that are similar to the vintage watches they're interested in. And then you sort of have them going towards what I'm going to refer to as heritage lines of watches, which is when brands take their historic pieces and do reissues of them. Longines is a great example of having a really great heritage line. Omega has released many, Tag Heuer has released some reissues, and this year obviously we're celebrating the anniversary of the Carrera and the Daytona, and I think the couple other watches, and so I think it would make sense that we'll probably see some reissues of some famous watches that they had. But through this reissue process, what we're seeing is the proportions of these watches are actually going back to the original proportions of what the watches used to be when they were originally released. And I think that is where that might be one of the reasons why people are sort of moving into that direction. A lot of the times if you blow up these watches, the proportions just look a little bit off if you're trying to incorporate them into these larger case sizes. Now, diameter doesn't have the diameter watch obviously is going to be the case size, but there's so much more to case size that make them sit differently on your wrist. I'll give you a perfect example here. So this right here is a Rolex, not a Rolex. This is a Memo Time Memo Sale Yacht Timer watch from the 1970s. This is an automatic version. Very few of these, at least right now, are sort of on the market. I think I only know of 3 examples of this watch, but this watch is like 44, 45 millimeters, and so it's going to be a little bit larger on the wrist. If you want to just do a size comparison, you can see that it's going to sit on someone's wrist very differently. But that isn't the only thing that really goes into the case, the size of how this is going to fit on your wrist. Very important components are the thickness of the case and also the length of the lugs. So if you look at the length of the lugs on this watch, you can see that they're fairly short. If you look where the case ends and sort of the length of that lug, it's very short. And so you actually find that this can fit on someone's wrist that's a little bit smaller because the lugs don't make it as pronounced over the sides of the individual's wrist. For me, 44, 45 millimeters is pretty big, but because these lugs are a little bit shorter, it doesn't have such a massive presence on the wrist that way. But another component that you have to think about is the thickness. So if you look at this watch's thickness, you can see it's way thicker. If you compare it to the Rolex Deepsea, I'll put this next to it, you can see the thickness of these watches are very different. Sorry, let me get it out of the frame so it focuses on the case, on the cases here. Give me a second. So if you look, you can see that the difference in case thickness is pretty substantial. And then if you take something like this Audemars Piguet here, and you take a look at the thickness of this, you can see it's far thinner compared to the Memo Sale that I just showed you. If we compare them both here. So you can see that the difference in thickness is quite substantial. Now this is a 33.5 millimeter watch versus the 10 millimeters that this has on it, but the thickness is going to dictate how it sits on the wrist. So you can see this one pretty flush on my wrist, but if you look at how this is going to sit, you're going to have it sit a lot higher. And so thickness, lug width and diameter are sort of all components that go into how a watch really sits on one's wrist. What you'll find in a lot of these modern reissues is a little bit of a larger feel to the watches because sometimes the movements are going to be a little bit thicker. Mainly the movements might be a little bit thicker than the original versions of these watches, and so that a lot of the times sort of drives the difference of how it's going to feel compared to the original. But I've sort of spoken a lot about vintage or modern watches, but I haven't really spoken about vintage watches a whole lot in this. I think vintage watch enthusiasts are a little bit more comfortable wearing 34, 30, 35, 36 millimeter watches, but they're, all 34 millimeter watches aren't really created equal. There are some that are, more desired by collectors, but what I've noticed is, instead of going for the steel sports watch vintage pieces, there is a subset of the community that is sort of going towards more classical watchmaking, more dress watch pieces. And I think that's all coming from the idea that I think the average watch collector is becoming more educated. They're looking for higher quality watches that are really, in my mind, standing on the shoulders of a lot of the vintage watch market. And so the histories of these watches and the fact that maybe they were developed in fewer quantities is I think what's interesting to collectors, as well as complications in general. I know on the podcast last week we discussed a trend that, I think it was a trend that was discussed on the Hodinky podcast was a desire for complications. And I can see that happening, but I do think that there is some interest still in time-only pieces. But so you were going from a 38 millimeter case size with a lot of the steel sports watch models that were very popular, let's say when the Paul Newman sold, but collectors are sort of becoming a little bit more open to different case sizes, especially, going towards the 35, 34, 33 millimeter case sizes. If you think about the Patek Philippe 130 chronograph, like it's a lot smaller than some of the other chronographs that are very desired, but it's still a very, very popular watch. And I think it's an exciting trend because I think it's being, I hate to get all personal, but I think it's being comfortable in one's skin. It's important that you're wearing watches that you're comfortable wearing, that you like having in your collection, you like having on your wrist, and being comfortable wearing a smaller millimeter in size watch it's only one factor. There's so much more that you can enjoy about watches, and you don't have to limit yourself to watches that are under 34 millimeters. Take this 6592 from Vacheron Constantin. This is an automatic piece, so you can actually see the thickness of this piece is obviously it's got a rotor in the watch, and so it's going to sit a little bit larger on your wrist. And if you saw the pictures of this watch on my Instagram, this watch fits my wrist so well, but it's 35 millimeters. And again, it goes back to the idea that these lugs are have its own sort of unique case shape to them, sort of unique claw-like lugs that make it sit differently on my wrist. And so you can find a lot of enjoyment out there in watches like that, in smaller case sizes. And so, again, I think this is exciting. Case size is only one factor that one should consider when looking at watches, whether it's vintage or modern. And I think there's so much more that you can enjoy besides the diameter of the watch. And the quality that you can get, even if it is a little bit of a smaller case size than you're used to wearing, is palpable, and I think you can definitely enjoy it. Let me know what you think. Do you think watch sizes are trending towards the smaller size? I think it's safe to say that is what's happening. We're sort of going back to this mean shape, and vintage watch enthusiasts are being more open to wearing case shapes that are not massive on their wrists. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. What is your favorite? My question for today is going to be, what is your favorite watch that you were surprised by when you put it on your wrist and realized the case shape really fit your wrist well? So let me know in the comment section below what you think about that. If you want to read more about this topic, there will be an article in the editorial section of lifeofnurse.com, so be sure to head over to lifeofnurse.com and check it out. If you are new to the channel, be sure to subscribe and share this with a friend who might be interested in watches. With that said, guys, thank you so much for watching this video, and until next time.